Here I have a sample W-2 form with box by box instructions that I actually put together. I've done it for 20 forms, and all of them are in my book, and also some of them are also on my website in an article on the top 15 tax forms. And basically, you can go to the instructions listed at the bottom on the IRS Gov, and there's a booklet with detailed information, about each of the boxes, what they mean. But obviously, not everyone has the time or energy to really go through these huge books. So this is kind of like a summary of what's in each of the box. And this is like general information because there are exceptions to every rule. And you will know that there are special situations. So I'm not going to go over that. I'm just going to go over the typical situations that taxpayers have and how to read your W-2. So W-2 form, it's about wages and tax statements. So basically, it has to be issued to taxpayers if you were paid more than $600, but many taxpayers receive it when they were paid $100 or even $20. And if you also had withholdings, that's another criteria that's used by the employers why they issue a form to their employees. Now, this is for employees, not independent contractors or gig workers. So you are considered an employee of the company. Now, you should receive it by January 31st, but sometimes people receive it late or not at all because maybe they have a wrong address or something wrong on their end. And if you did not receive it, you can reach out to your employer, obviously. And if that doesn't work, you can also reach out to an IRS to receive a transcript of what was sent to them to get like a replacement, basically. If there's a mistake on this form, you can reach out to your employer and try to get it corrected. To get it corrected, you have to file Form W-2C, C for correction. So let's go over some of these main boxes and what information we have. Now, this is a dummy information. So this is I usually use this as an example. I have Jane here, and Jane received this. So in box A, this is her social security number. This is a dummy number, obviously. And then in box B, we have the employer identification number. So it's kind of like a social security for an employer, but it's not as sensitive as the employee social security information. Sometimes you can even find it Google for that information for some employer. Now, it's also the 9 digits, so it can be confusing. But if you put this incorrectly, like if you're preparing your tax returns, you can get a rejection of your tax return. So it's important to make sure you have it correctly when you enter it. Now, then in box C, we have the information on the company you work for. Now, sometimes you might be a company that you don't recognize and you'll be like, I didn't work for this employer, but it might be a subsidiary or a parent company, so it might not look familiar, but it is the employer you work for. So just double check it, but be aware that not exactly necessarily be the same name of the company or place you worked at. Box D, here, this box, it's basically a control number that you use when you import your W-2 into software. And sometimes, they ask you for that number, and it helps them to make sure that they import the correct information. But many times it can be blank. So if it's blank, do not worry about it. There's nothing wrong with it. Now, box E is, your information, your address on file with the employer. If it's incorrect, you want to make sure you go and change that, update that information. Now, let's go through the boxes, the numbers, basically in box 1 through 20. So at the top, we have your wages, tips, and other compensation. And these are your employee wages. Excuse me. And then in box 2, you have how much was withheld for your federal tax, income tax. And so in our situation, we have 10%. So you'll be like 10% tax bracket almost. But that employer doesn't know if Jane maybe worked in a couple of other jobs, and maybe she has 3 of these jobs and now she makes 90,000. So if she withheld 10% from each job, that's going to be short for her when she files taxes, assuming she's single, no dependents, so if it's a simple situation. But I'm just saying that be aware that this not necessarily will match what's required for you to pay in taxes for the year. So this is kind of like just a starting point. But this shows you, in this case, this is a 10% bracket, because if you divide 30 by 3 by 30,000, that's 10%. Now, box 3, we have Social Security wages. So Social Security wages are subject to tax if up to $142,800 for 2021, and they adjust it slightly every year. And basically, if you have more in that in wages than that, then you should not pay the Social Security tax. Now, Social Security wages withheld are listed in box 4. So 6.2% is required to be paid by the employer and by the employee. So this just lists what you've paid. So what you've paid towards your Social Security. And if you make you have a couple of jobs, you could have situation where too much was withheld, because maybe the 3 jobs add up to more than $142,800. So you do want to double check if that's the situation. You have to have it corrected. There's a form you have to file on your tax return to get some of it back. Now, Medicare wages, box 5. So it's similar to the Social Security wages. Medicare wages are subject to tax, and the tax rate for Medicare is 1.45% for the employee and for the employer. So this is listing what you've paid. It doesn't list what the employer paid on your behalf. And so this is 1.45% of the Medicare wages. So if you take the box 5 times 1.45, this is what you should have. Now, these are typical situations. There could be some unusual circumstances, and there could be some exemptions and so on. So your situation might be different, but this is a more most frequently found situation for taxpayers. Now, box 7, we have Social Security tips. So these are the tips that you reported to your employer. So, if you got some tips, you reported to your employer, they would be listed here. Now, allocated tips in box 8, on the other hand, tips the employer calculated that are attributable to the employee. So let's say if you work in some big restaurant and maybe the standard tip for the big parties, it's 8 or 10% or so. The employer will allocate, how much, they receive for, from their customers, allocate that amount to you. And that's not part of box 1. And it could be different, but that's what's allocated by the employer. Now, let's go through box 10. This is here. We have a list of dependent care benefits. So if you put any money towards, dependent care, like if you have a daycare or what have you, and, you paid for services to basically watch your kids, take care of your kids when you're working, that's what be the amount. And you have to check with your job what they do if you don't use these benefits. You could lose them in some situations. Sometimes you can extend them, but that's something you have to talk to your employer. Now, in box 12, this is like a big box, and it has number of subsections, and here you basically can list different codes. So this lists benefits that you can receive from your employer, and I just listed standard ones. And usually when you flip your W-2, or maybe like if it's a printout underneath, you will have a list of all possible codes, but these are the most frequently used. So we have, this group life insurance, which is code C. In our case, Jane has code D, which is 401k contribution. So she has a 401k plan, and you can see this is a pre-tax money, because that $2,000 plus the wages in box 1 is the it amounts to 32,000. So you see she made 32,000, but taxable amount is the 30,000 right here in box 1, because the 401k contribution, that's the benefit of the plan. Primarily, it's pre-tax. So you want to check that this is accurate. This is what you had contributed to your plan. Now you also have another code that frequently comes up. Is code W, which is HSA contributions towards like a investment that you can use later on, that money to pay medical expenses out of pocket. There's some qualification to get that, but that would be also listed in box 12 here. Now, another one that's very frequently listed, it's called DD, which is employer-sponsored health coverage. So this shows you how much the employer basically paid for towards your health coverage, and you probably contributed as well. So that's box 12, the typical codes that you can list there. Now, box 13 has 3 different boxes, and here you have, if you're a statutory employee, so this is like a very infrequent category of an employee, and that's between being an employee and independent contractor. So that's really out of scope for this discussion, but it can be checked here. Then we have retirement plan. So this will show whether you have retirement plan. So right now I know that Jane had contribution to 401k, so this box should be checked. Now you can have a situation when this box is checked, but there's nothing really that was contributed. So maybe Jane opted out and she didn't contribute, but this box will be checked to tell the programs, the tax preparation, the tax preparers, that you did have the option, but you chose not to. And this can really matter in situations where you have middle income taxpayers and they have healthcare plans, and they may be kept out contributing certain amount to certain plans, and might not get some benefits when they actually had that box checked and they contributed some other plans. So it's a more specific situation, but I actually came across myself. So you can watch for that as well in certain situations. And then the third one is third-party sick pay. Box 14, another thing that you can have here, you could have union dues and some unusual things that kind of like don't fall into any of these boxes. And then we go to the end of W-2, which is box 16 to 20. So here is going to be a list of which state you worked at and worked in, and it's going to be listed here, as well as the state ID number, which usually is the same as the employee identification number plus some additional numbers. The state wages should be the same as box 1, unless you work for multiple states, so they could be split here. And then box 17 is important because this is how much in-state income tax was withheld towards that state. So it's important, especially if you've worked in few, make sure that you list them all when you're preparing your taxes. And then you could also have local wages and local income tax and locality name. Now this is less frequent. Most of the time you see that maybe in New York City or so. Some very few local places do that, but you could have it. So it's possible. Now at the bottom of the W-2 you have this kind of like information of copy A, B, C, D, 1 or 2. So you could actually have, like with a lot of tax forms, you will receive multiple of them and they could be for different purposes. Like this one says, to be filed with employees' federal tax return. Now, you might not actually send it anywhere because when you use tax software, you create a digital copy of it and that's being, transmitted with your tax returns. But there's situation in some people still paper file, about 10% of people still paper file, so they might have to include that one copy. And I think that's all we talked about, all the boxes, and hopefully this helps you understand your W-2, some of the information that's presented there, and you feel more comfortable. So thanks for watching.